There are various kinds of strike. It depends on where you hit and what weapon you will be using. To the eyes, you would use fingers. Don't worry. To the eyes. Or straight at the face, from the waist, everything on.
Before Bruce Lee became a global martial arts icon, he had to prove that his unusual approach to fighting could stand out among experienced martial artists. What happened next became one of the most talked-about demonstrations of his career and helped change how people viewed martial arts performances. Lee was not simply trying to impress the crowd, he was showing what could happen when speed, precision, and power worked together. But how did he create such a record-breaking moment? And why did it have such a lasting effect on karate? Join us as we take a closer look. Bruce Lee's fight that changed his view of martial arts. Long before the arena went silent, and before Vic Moore ever stepped onto that stage, Bruce Lee was almost unknown in America. He had no fame, no cameras, and no large audience waiting to hear his name. He was simply a skinny 20-year-old Chinese kid who stepped off a ship in San Francisco with very little in his pocket and a head full of ideas that many people in America were not ready to hear. Bruce had been born in San Francisco in 1940, but much of his real martial arts education had taken place in Hong Kong. He grew up around alleys and rooftops, where street fights were common. His training in Wing Chun under Yip Man gave his fighting ability structure, discipline, and purpose. Now that he was back in America, Bruce had a quiet but very strong mission. He wanted to prove that Kung Fu was not simply folklore or something people could dismiss without understanding. He started small. His teaching began in a garage in Seattle before moving to Oakland and later Los Angeles. He charged $20 a month and opened his doors to almost everyone. His students included college students, housewives, black students from the rougher parts of Oakland, Berkeley hippies, boxers, and karate practitioners who had already heard rumors about a teacher who seemed faster than the human eye could follow. To Bruce, this was how martial arts should be. A fighter was a fighter, and training should not be limited by background. But to the traditional martial arts community, his approach was a serious problem waiting to explode. The American martial arts world Bruce entered was largely a closed club. Karate was becoming increasingly popular. Judo already had the respect that came with Olympic recognition. Boxing was still the dominant name in fighting. Kung Fu, in comparison, was often misunderstood and dismissed. Some people looked at Bruce, who stood only 5 feet 7 inches tall, and openly questioned whether he could survive a real fight against a karate champion. Then Yoichi Nakachi came looking for him. Nakachi was a third-degree black belt in karate and a third-degree black belt in judo. He was also the founder of his own system, Shin-Pu Ren. The two men met on a YMCA handball court. There was no referee. There were sworn witnesses. 11 seconds later, Nakachi was unconscious on the floor with a fractured skull. Bruce's foot had struck his head with tremendous force. Years of training had been overcome in less time than it takes to tie a shoe. But the people who could have helped make Bruce famous were not in that room. The witnesses kept their promise, and the fight remained buried in whispers. Bruce had made a powerful statement, but only a very small audience had seen it. If he wanted people to take notice, he would have to prove himself again, but this time on a much bigger stage. In 1964, a man arrived at the door of Bruce's Oakland school wearing traditional Kung Fu robes. He was not smiling. His name was Wong Jack Man. In his hand was a piece of paper signed by elders from San Francisco's Chinatown. The message carried an ultimatum that may sound extreme today, but was taken very seriously at the time. Bruce was being told to stop teaching Kung Fu to non-Chinese students immediately, or he would have to fight the man they had chosen. There was no third option. Bruce read the paper, laughed, and told Wong to start warming up. For generations, there had been an unspoken belief that Chinese martial arts belonged to Chinese people. The forms, techniques, and knowledge were viewed as something that belonged within families and communities. Teaching white students could be seen as a betrayal of that tradition. Bruce did not see it that way. His students paid rent, and the rent had to be covered. More importantly, Bruce believed that a fighter was a fighter, regardless of skin color. The fight began with both men circling each other and testing distance. Bruce expected a traditional fighter who would rely on classical movements and remain within the range where his Wing Chun was strongest. Wong did not give him that kind of fight. Instead, Wong moved backward. Then he continued moving backward. Whenever Bruce tried to close the distance, Wong would pivot and reset. It was not simply a matter of fear or weakness. It was a strategy. Wing Chun was designed to work within close range. Beyond that distance, its effectiveness was limited. 3 minutes of chasing an opponent around a small room was much harder than it sounded. Bruce's lungs were burning, and his legs began to shake. His famous Wing Chun footwork started to break down because he was facing an opponent who refused to remain in one place. The accounts of how the fight ended would later become deeply divided. Linda Lee said the fight lasted 3 minutes, with Wong eventually trying to escape. Wong gave a different account, claiming the fight lasted 20 minutes and ended in a draw. Bruce's students supported Linda's version, while Wong's supporters backed his account. Yet every version agreed on one important point. Bruce had not been able to finish the fight quickly. That mattered to him. Later that night, in the small apartment above his school, Bruce sat with Linda and expressed what the fight had made clear to him. He was finished with classical martial arts. He had won the fight, but he had also lost his faith in the traditional system. That realization would change the direction of his martial arts thinking and shape the work he pursued during the next decade. Unbelievable test of speed at Long Beach. The summer of 1967 was hot and loud, and Bruce Lee was returning to the Long Beach International Karate Tournament with a very different kind of pressure on his shoulders. He had been there 3 years earlier, in 1964, and had already left a small but unforgettable mark. During that appearance, he demonstrated a 1-inch punch that sent a man flying backward. Now, Bruce was back, but the stakes were much higher. At the time, the American martial arts community was tired of hearing about Kung Fu. Karate dominated the tournament circuit. Judo had Olympic legitimacy. Boxing was already considered the king of fighting. Almost nobody questioned these established styles. Kung Fu, meanwhile, was still viewed as the strange cousin standing in the corner, associated with silk uniforms and philosophical ideas. Many serious fighters had quietly decided that Kung Fu might look beautiful in movies, but had little use in a real exchange. That was the environment Bruce Lee was walking into. The room was filled with some of the most respected and decorated karate fighters in America. Chuck Norris was already known as a fierce tournament fighter. Mike Stone had built a reputation through his aggressive style, even against larger opponents. Joe Louis would later become one of the important figures in American kickboxing. Bruce knew that if he stumbled in front of these fighters, even slightly, the judgment could be made immediately. He began by showing something simple but extraordinary. Bruce got down in front of the audience and performed 2-finger push-ups. His body stayed straight as a plank as he lowered his entire body onto 2 fingers of one hand. Then he pushed himself back up and repeated the movement. The room became quiet. It was the kind of silence that happens when experienced professionals realize they are watching something they have never personally seen done. But Bruce was not finished. He called up his student, Taki Kimura, and placed a blindfold over his own eyes. Kimura then attacked him with real strikes from different angles. Bruce intercepted the attacks. At times, he moved past the strikes before they reached him. At other times, he met them at the joint and redirected them before they could complete their path. The blindfold did not appear to slow him down. For Bruce, this demonstrated an idea he had been arguing for years. Mastery was not simply about memorizing forms. It was about instinct, timing, and the ability to read a body as it began to move. Then, a major challenge appeared. A 4-time world karate champion stepped forward from the other side of the room. His name was Vic Moore. He was a 10th-degree black belt and a fighter whose record had been built in some of the toughest arenas on the tournament circuit. If anyone there could expose Bruce Lee as a performer instead of a real fighter, Vic Moore seemed like the person who could do it. Bruce explained the challenge calmly. He would throw one straight punch toward Moore's face. Moore did not have to block the punch completely. He did not even have to stop it. He only had to touch Bruce's hand at any point as the punch came toward him. Any contact would count. If Moore could do it, Bruce would publicly admit defeat right there. The challenge sounded almost too simple. Every trained fighter in the room had spent years practicing how to block incoming strikes. Touching a hand as it moved toward the face should have been a basic reflex. But this was not really a test of reflex. It was a test of speed. Bruce settled into his stance. He barely seemed to move. Moore raised his guard, locked his eyes on Bruce, and prepared himself. Then it happened. There was a blur, and Bruce's punch was already there, stopping just short of Moore's face, before disappearing again. Moore had not been able to touch it. His arm remained almost exactly where it had been before the punch began. Bruce reset. Moore did the same, this time with even greater focus. The result was unchanged. The fist came and went before Moore could react. The world champion was not frozen because he was afraid. There simply seemed to be no time to make a decision. By the time his nervous system processed the threat, the punch had already arrived and disappeared. They tried again and again. Every time, Bruce's fist passed through Moore's defense, as if the defense were not there. The crowd became silent. Hundreds of trained eyes were focused on Bruce Lee, yet they could no longer seem to process his movement clearly. Years later, Moore gave a different account of what happened. He claimed that he had blocked some of Bruce's punches and had even landed strikes of his own. However, no footage supported that version, and no witness backed it up. The fighters who had been present, including Chuck Norris and Joe Louis, had seen what happened. The power was faster than the camera could see. A man named Bob Baker stood on the Long Beach stage with his arms crossed and a skeptical smirk on his face. He had volunteered to take whatever Bruce Lee was about to throw at him, but he was not expecting to be impressed. Baker had seen plenty of fake martial arts tricks before, and he was openly doubtful about what Bruce could do. Bruce raised his right hand and placed his fist against Baker's chest, leaving about an inch of space between his knuckles and Baker's shirt. He then told Baker to brace himself. What happened next barely looked like a punch. There was almost no visible movement. Bruce made a small jolt with his body and a quick snap of his wrist. Then Baker was suddenly thrown backward, crashing into a folding chair that likely kept him from going through the wall. The room became silent. Every fighter watching understood the basic rule. Punches need distance to build power. But Bruce had just appeared to break that rule right in front of them. A Stanford biomechanics researcher named Jessica Rose later spent months studying the footage. Her calculations repeatedly produced numbers that seemed almost impossible. From only about an inch of movement, Bruce had generated more than 1,500 newtons of force, enough to crack ribs with the ease of snapping breadsticks. The power was not simply coming from his arm. It began with his back foot, which pressed firmly into the floor. The force moved through his calf, then twisted through his thigh. It accelerated through his hip rotation, snapped through his core, traveled through his shoulder, and finally exploded into his fist. At the very last moment, his wrist snapped like the end of a whip. Bruce had spent 15 years learning how to perform that entire sequence with millisecond precision. Most martial artists generated only about 30% of their potential power because their muscle groups could work against one another. Bruce had unlocked the other 70%. He also challenged the traditional boxing idea of how a punch should be delivered. He turned his lead hand into a weapon that was fast, accurate, and powerful. He treated the strike more like a fencer's thrust, sharp, direct, and controlled. Hundreds of fighters have studied that footage since 1964. They copied Bruce's stance, practiced the rotation, and trained the weight transfer for years. Some were able to push a man backward a few feet. Yet, after 60 years of attempts, nobody matched the original. The same incredible speed became a problem when Bruce began working in film. William Bodine had directed more than 300 films by the time he arrived on the set of The Green Hornet in 1966. He had worked through the silent era, the arrival of sound films, and nearly every major technical change Hollywood had experienced. Still, nothing prepared him for what came back from the lab after Bruce threw his first punch on camera. The footage appeared to be broken. In one frame, Bruce was standing still. In the next, the stuntman was already flying backward. There seemed to be no movement between the two frames. The camera department spent hours checking the equipment because they believed something had gone wrong. But the equipment was working perfectly. Film had been running at 24 frames per second since the 1920s, yet Bruce was completing his punches in less than 1/24th of a second. He was moving between the frames, becoming almost invisible to a technology designed to capture human movement. Specialized equipment eventually measured one of his punches at 1/500th of a second from the beginning of the movement to impact. That was faster than the time the brain needed to process that something had moved. Because of this, the producers had to ask one of America's most skilled martial artists to deliberately slow himself down for the cameras. Bruce had spent 15 years training to become faster. Now, the cameras needed him to become slower. His famous coin trick became one of his favorite demonstrations. He would place a dime in someone's open palm from 3 feet away and tell them to close their hand the instant they saw him move. They would confidently agree. Bruce would twitch. Their hand would immediately close around the coin. But when they opened it, they would find a penny instead. The dime was already back in Bruce's hand. He had crossed the 3 feet, opened their palm, switched the coins, and returned to his original position before their brain had registered the movement. During one training session, Bruce told a student to block a light tap. The student dislocated his own shoulder, not because of the impact, but because his body tried to react to something moving faster than his nervous system could process. From traditional fighter to Jeet Kune Do, the garage looked like a library had crashed into a gym. Books covered the walls, while anatomy textbooks sat beside Buddhist philosophy. Bodybuilding magazines were stacked on top of old combat manuals. By 1965, Bruce Lee owned more than 2,500 books, and many were filled with pencil notes in the margins. Bruce was no longer simply training. He was studying combat with the focus of a scientist studying a virus. Two men quietly influenced the way he thought about physical training. James Yim Lee, an Oakland welder who had been lifting weights since the 1940s, at a time when many martial artists believed weight training would make them slower, and Alan Joe, the first Chinese-American bodybuilding champion. Bruce would arrive at dawn and question them while they bench pressed. Through these discussions, he began to find an answer that would completely change his approach to fighting. Traditional fighters often trained techniques. They repeated the same punch thousands of times until it looked perfect. Bruce began to believe that this was not the most important question. Instead, he wanted to understand what actually made a punch powerful and effective. He connected speed to fast-twitch muscle fibers and power to the ability to connect the entire body into one coordinated movement. Because of this, he changed his approach. Instead of focusing only on techniques, he trained physical attributes. His goal was to develop the qualities first, so that any technique could benefit from them. His weekly training became highly structured. Monday was for weights, with no more than 8 repetitions. Tuesday was for running. Wednesday focused on flexibility. Thursday worked different muscle groups. Friday was for the heavy bag, and Saturday was for sparring. Sunday was supposed to be his day off, but even then, Linda could find him doing fingertip push-ups while reading a book on the floor. Progressive overload became extremely important to Bruce. He believed every training session needed to be harder than the one before it. He carefully recorded his workouts in notebooks, almost like an accountant keeping detailed records. By 1967, he had reduced his workouts to 30-minute sessions that were so concentrated that visitors reportedly found watching him train more exhausting than exercising themselves. He carried spring-loaded grippers with him everywhere and could bend bottle caps with his thumb while speaking. Bruce also began studying fighting with the careful thinking of an engineer studying a bridge. The rigid stances of Wing Chun were pushed aside. Boxing footwork replaced them, followed by the straight thrust of fencing. His body had been developed through intense training. Now he needed to challenge the philosophy that had shaped his martial arts education. One afternoon in 1967, Bruce entered his school carrying a cardboard box. Inside were nearly 20 years of his life. It contained certificates from Hong Kong, belts, and diplomas signed by masters who had taught him when he was a child. As his students entered for class, they watched him place the box on the floor. He then emptied everything into a metal trash can and set it on fire. The room became silent as the belts curled in the heat and the papers turned black. Bruce had decided to leave behind what he saw as unnecessary attachment to classical martial arts. He gave his new philosophy the name Jeet Kune Do, meaning the way of the intercepting fist. The idea was simple but powerful. Most fighters waited for an attack and then reacted. They blocked, parried, moved away, and countered. Bruce believed that waiting meant the opportunity had already been lost. Instead, he wanted to intercept an attack before it was fully launched, such as catching a punch as the shoulder began to move. Three principles became central to his approach: simplicity, directness, and freedom. Simplicity meant doing in one movement what others might do in two. Directness meant taking the shortest path between the fist and the target. Freedom meant being adaptable, like water, able to crash like a wave or flow around an obstacle depending on what the situation required. His central principle became absorb what is useful, discard what is not, and add what is uniquely your own. Bruce kept Wing Chun's chain punches while taking boxing's footwork and rhythm, fencing's straight thrust, and judo's leverage and control. He combined these elements into something new. But Jeet Kune Do was never only about hitting harder. Bruce taught that the person standing across from you was often not the real opponent. The deeper opponent was your own doubt, fear, and attachment to one rigid idea. His philosophy of being like water captured this perfectly. Flow when necessary, crash when necessary, and never become trapped by one fixed form. Traditional martial arts practitioners resisted his ideas, and some sent their best students to test him. Those students left bruised and confused, while his own students began winning street fights within 6 months. The system had shown results. Now Bruce Lee had to prove it in front of cameras and champions, turning every limitation into strength. Bruce Lee could hold his entire body weight on 2 fingers while having a relaxed conversation about Taoism. This was not simply a quick photograph or a display for attention. He could also perform 200 fingertip push-ups in a row while explaining the difference between classical and modern training to anyone around him. Each finger carried around 40 pounds of dynamic weight during every repetition, while his breathing remained even. For him, this was part of his warm-up. The training that built his finger strength had started in his backyard with a bucket of sand. Every morning at 5, Bruce drove his fingertips into the sand 500 times. After 6 months, when the sand no longer felt difficult, he moved on to gravel. The sharp edges damaged his skin every day, and he sometimes finished his sessions with blood mixed into the stones. Most people would have faced serious injury from such training. Bruce instead developed extremely conditioned fingertips. They were sensitive enough to feel a heartbeat through clothing, while also becoming hard enough to break wood. Next came steel ball bearings. They were small, heavy, and difficult to strike correctly because they rolled away whenever a finger landed even slightly off-center. Bruce performed 500 strikes every morning before breakfast. When doctors later examined him, his bone density was reportedly beyond their measurement charts. His tendons had also become extremely thick and strong, described as being more like steel cables than ordinary human tissue. In 1969, Bruce stood before a crowd holding a 1-inch thick oak board. Without a wind-up, he placed his fingertips against the wood and drove them through it. The sound was described as being closer to fabric tearing than wood cracking. Some people believed the board had been weakened, so Bruce invited them to bring their own boards. The result remained the same. Dan Inosanto gave Bruce his first nunchaku in 1964. Bruce initially laughed and treated it like a toy. During his first attempt to swing it, he struck himself in the head hard enough to draw blood. 3 months later, he was using the nunchaku while playing ping pong, returning every shot and discussing philosophy between volleys. Another extreme example of his conditioning was his heavy bag. Bruce owned a 300-pound bag that most fighters could not move with a full-power kick. Bruce could strike it with a side kick and send it swinging until it became almost parallel with the ground, with the chain going completely slack from the force. He would then kick it again on the backswing, sending it in the opposite direction. He could maintain this rhythm for several minutes while breathing as steadily as if he were simply walking. Bruce Lee could not clearly see the faces of his students from across the training room. His eyesight was -5 diopters in both eyes. When the United States Army tested his eyes in 1963, he was classified as 4F and considered medically unfit. The eyesight that kept him from carrying a rifle did not stop him from becoming a highly feared fighter. Instead, Bruce rebuilt his fighting system around the limitation. He stopped depending on clearly seeing movements and learned to read the body. A shoulder could drop slightly before a punch launched. The hips could rotate milliseconds before a kick fired. Weight could shift from the back foot to the front before a forward attack. Bruce trained himself to notice these small signs through the blur. He stopped depending on fine detail and focused on shape and movement. Over time, he developed an unusual ability to sense changes in air pressure when limbs moved through space. The movement of air caused by a punch could reach him before the punch itself. Training partners said sparring with him felt like fighting someone with radar. He could avoid attacks from his blind spots and respond with counters he could not have clearly seen. Chisao, the Wing Chun sensitivity drill in which two fighters maintain constant arm contact, became an important part of this training. Dan Inosanto would completely blindfold Bruce, yet Bruce could still control entire matches. He could identify the attacks students were preparing to make by detecting tiny changes in the muscles of their connected arms. The training continued beyond the school. Bruce walked through his home in complete darkness, practicing forms in rooms where he could not see the walls. He also had students attack him randomly while his eyes were covered, forcing himself to respond through sound and air movement alone. This was not mystical training. It was a practical adaptation repeated until it became reflex. Bruce also dealt with the limitations of the contact lenses available during the 1960s. The hard plastic lenses could scrape the cornea with every blink. He wore them throughout his films despite the constant pain they caused. During breaks between takes on Enter the Dragon, he would leave to apply numbing drops that provided very little relief. The intense focus in his eyes on screen was partly connected to forcing himself to concentrate while wearing the uncomfortable plastic lenses. He kept this problem from the film crews, and Linda revealed it years after his death. To his enemies, his glasses appeared to reveal a weakness. What they did not know was that Bruce had spent 2 decades adapting to that weakness until it became one of the sharpest senses in the room. What do you think about Bruce Lee? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Before you go, be sure to click on the video shown on your screen.